In the ancient chronicles of the galaxy, long before the Empire's rise, there existed a Jedi Knight whose name would echo through eternity as both warning and tragedy. A warrior of such brilliance that his light blinded him to the creeping shadows within his own heart. Picture a golden-haired champion standing before the Galactic Senate, lightsaber gleaming with righteous purpose. Now see that same warrior years later, eyes burning yellow with Sith fire, his blade dripping with his own master's blood. This is the story of Ulic Qel-Droma, the brightest star in the Jedi constellation, who fell into darkness so complete that the galaxy itself trembled. A man who believed his conviction made him immune to corruption, who thought understanding evil would give him power over it, who walked willingly into shadow, certain he could emerge unchanged. But the dark side does not bargain. It does not negotiate. It seduces. It whispers. It promises strength while stealing your soul one choice at a time. Tonight, you will hear how a noble protector became a Sith warlord, how brotherly love ended in fratricide, how the woman who loved him was forced to sever him from the very force that gave his life meaning. You will witness the great Sith War, where entire star systems burned and ancient Jedi wisdom turned to ash. And in the end, you will discover whether redemption is possible for one who has committed the unforgivable. So before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy deep dives into Star Wars legends. And here is something interesting. 64% of you watching right now have not yet subscribed. If you are finding value in these stories, hitting that subscribe button truly helps this channel grow and allows me to bring you more forgotten tales from a galaxy far, far away. Drop a comment below, telling me where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I genuinely love seeing our community span across time zones and continents. There is something special about knowing we are all connected through these ancient stories, whether you are starting your day or ending your night. Now dim the lights, get comfortable under your blanket, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through the tragedy of Ulic Qel-Droma. 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, before the Empire, before even the name Skywalker was whispered among the stars, the Galactic Republic stood at the height of its ancient glory. The Jedi Order numbered in the thousands, their temples gleaming across 100 worlds, their wisdom guiding civilization through an age of relative peace. On the library world of Ossus, massive archives held holocrons containing millennia of accumulated knowledge. Jedi Masters walked gardens where the Force flowed like invisible rivers, training the next generation in the eternal balance between light and darkness. It was an era of legends, of heroes whose names would echo across the ages, and among the brightest of these rising stars was a young man from the peaceful world of Alderaan. Ulic Qel-Droma stood tall and confident, his golden hair catching sunlight as he moved through the training courtyards. Broad-shouldered and strong, he carried himself with the natural grace of a born warrior. His blue eyes held fierce intelligence and unwavering determination. When he ignited his lightsaber, the blade sang with perfect control, an extension of his will made manifest through the Force. Other Jedi watched him train and saw greatness. They saw a future leader, perhaps even a legend in the making. He had been trained alongside his younger brother, Qel-Droma, under the legendary Master Jeth of Arcania. The three had formed a bond deeper than mere teacher and students. They were family. Arca, ancient and wise, with snow-white hair and eyes that seemed to see through time itself, had guided both brothers from childhood, shaping them into exemplary Jedi Knights. Where Kay was cautious and thoughtful, Ulic was passionate and decisive. Where Kay questioned, Ulic acted. Together they balanced each other perfectly. Among Ulic's closest companions was Nomi Sunrider, a widow who had discovered her own Force sensitivity after her husband's murder. She had arrived at the Jedi temples carrying her infant daughter Vima, determined to honor her late husband's legacy by becoming a Jedi herself. Nomi possessed remarkable power, particularly in Force techniques of protection and meditation. Her strength was quiet but undeniable, her wisdom hard-earned through tragedy. As she and Ulic trained together, fought together, meditated together, something deeper than friendship began to grow between them. A connection, a possibility of love. The Jedi Order also counted among its ranks the Twi'lek warrior Tot Donata, the stoic Dicey Diath, and a married pair of Cathar Jedi named Silvar and Krydo. These warriors, along with dozens of others, formed a close brotherhood of knights who genuinely believed they were ushering in a new golden age. They were young, they were powerful, they were certain that together no darkness could stand against them. How tragically wrong they would prove to be. Ulic Qel-Droma, more than any other, embodied this dangerous confidence. He had studied the ancient Sith texts in the archives, not to learn their ways, but to understand the enemy. He had meditated on the nature of the dark side, convinced that knowledge was armor against corruption. He believed with absolute certainty that his training, his strength, his conviction in the light would make him immune to temptation. This belief, this unshakable confidence in his own incorruptibility, was the first seed of his eventual fall, for the dark side does not announce itself with trumpets and declarations. It creeps in through the cracks of pride. It whispers justifications. It promises that you are different, that you are strong enough to use its power without being consumed. And Ulic, standing tall in the Ossus Gardens with his lightsaber gleaming and his future bright, had no idea that the shadow he cast was already growing longer than the light that created it. The galaxy was about to test him, and he was about to fail in ways that would reshape the fate of billions. The first shadows appeared, not with thunder, but with whispers from a tomb 4 centuries old. In the wealthy Empress Teta system, 2 aristocratic siblings named Satel Keto and Alima Keto stumbled upon something that would alter the course of galactic history. While exploring their family's Iron Citadel museum, surrounded by artifacts from 1,000 conquered worlds, they discovered a collection that had been locked away and forgotten. Ancient Sith texts, holocrons glowing with ominous energy, amulets that seemed to pulse with their own dark heartbeat. Satel, the older brother, was brilliant but arrogant. He believed knowledge itself held no moral alignment, that understanding ancient evil was simply intellectual pursuit. Alima, beautiful and ambitious, saw something else entirely in those forbidden pages. She saw power, real power, the kind that could elevate them beyond mere aristocracy into something legendary. Night after night, they descended into the museum's deepest vaults. They deciphered languages dead for millennia. They practiced techniques that no Jedi would dare attempt. The dark side responded to their curiosity like a predator recognizing prey. It taught them, it seduced them, it transformed them. Within months, the siblings had learned enough Sith sorcery to become intoxicated by their own capabilities. Satel could manipulate minds with barely a gesture. Alima discovered she could conjure illusions so real they could kill. Together they made a decision that would damn countless billions. They murdered their own parents. King Keto and Queen Magda Keto died in their sleep, their hearts stopped by invisible hands, their screams silenced before they could form. Satel took the throne. Alima stood beside him as high priestess of a new order they called the Krath, and they began converting other nobility to their cause, one dark ritual at a time. The Empress Teta system, once known for art and culture, became a breeding ground for Sith worship. But thousands of light years away, on a completely different world, another darkness stirred. The planet Onderon had been haunted for 400 years by the ghost of a fallen Jedi named Freedon Nad. Once a promising student, Nad had sought forbidden knowledge and transformed himself into a Sith Lord. When his physical body finally died, his spirit refused to move on. Instead, it lingered, whispering to Onderon's rulers generation after generation, ensuring that Sith influence never truly died. By the time Ulic Qel-Droma arrived on Onderon, the corruption had reached its peak. The planet was divided between the civilized city dwellers and the beast riders, exiled warriors who lived in the wilderness, mounted on enormous flying creatures. This division was no accident. Freedon Nad's spirit had engineered centuries of conflict, feeding on hatred and violence to sustain his own existence between life and death. Ulic arrived with his brother Kay and the Twi'lek Jedi taught Daneta, sent by the Republic to mediate the escalating violence. They found a powder keg ready to explode. Princess Gallia, a reformer who sought peace with the Beast Riders, was being undermined by her own family. Her mother, Queen Amanoa, wore Sith amulets hidden beneath royal robes, and deep in the palace catacombs, a figure named King Omen lay in shadows, kept alive far beyond natural years through dark side alchemy, his body withered but his mind sharp with malevolent purpose. The Jedi quickly realized this was no simple political dispute. This was Sith corruption that had rotted Onderon from within for centuries. Battle erupted through the palace corridors. Sith war droids, ancient machines powered by dark side energy, activated from hidden chambers. Their weapons crackled with red energy as they marched against Ulic and his companions. The young Jedi moved through them like lightning, his blade cutting through metal and circuitry, but for every droid that fell, two more emerged from the shadows. Queen Amanoa revealed herself, no longer pretending civility. She wielded the Force with wild, untrained fury, throwing Jedi across rooms with telekinetic waves. Her power came not from training but from the Sith amulets she wore, artifacts that channeled dark side energy directly into her body. She was a conduit rather than a master, and that made her both dangerous and unstable. Ulic fought his way to her through waves of guards and droids. When their lightsabers finally met, he saw the madness in her eyes. This was not a villain who had chosen evil through philosophy. This was someone corrupted by forces she barely understood, transformed into a puppet for ancient darkness. The duel was brief, but brutal. Ulic's training and discipline overwhelmed her raw but unfocused power. He disarmed her, sending her lightsaber clattering across marble floors. And then Master Arkajeth arrived, his presence like sunlight cutting through storm clouds. With a gesture, Arca used the Force to tear the Sith amulets from Queen Amanoa's body. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. Without the dark side energy sustaining her, her body began to age rapidly. Decades of borrowed life caught up in seconds. She crumpled to the floor, her scream fading as her body withered, until nothing remained but dust and robes. The palace fell silent. The droids deactivated. The battle was over. But as Ulic stood there, breathing hard, his lightsaber still humming, he felt something, a presence watching him, a cold intelligence studying him from somewhere deeper in the palace. Following that sensation, he descended into catacombs that hadn't seen sunlight in generations. There, in a massive underground chamber, he found it. The sarcophagus of Freedon Nad sat on a raised platform, surrounded by offerings left by generations of corrupted rulers. Dark side energy rolled off the tomb in waves, making the air itself feel thick and poisonous. Ulic approached slowly, his Jedi training screaming warnings, his instincts telling him to leave immediately. But curiosity held him. Not evil curiosity, not dark temptation, simply the desire to understand. How did a Jedi fall so completely? What knowledge did Nad possess that seemed worth trading his soul? If Ulic could understand the mechanism of corruption, couldn't he better defend against it? He placed his hand on the cold stone of the sarcophagus, and for just a moment he heard whispers, promises of knowledge, offers of power. visions of what he could become if he simply opened his mind to possibilities the Jedi Council feared to explore. Ulic pulled his hand back as if burned. His heart raced. Master Arca appeared behind him, having followed his student into the depths. The old master's eyes held no judgment, only concern. He understood what Ulic was feeling, because every Jedi felt it eventually. The curiosity, the certainty that understanding darkness didn't mean embracing it, the dangerous belief that you could touch shadow without being stained. They left Onderon believing they had won. King Amen was captured. Queen Amenoa was dead. Princess Gallia would rule with wisdom and compassion. The beast riders and city dwellers had begun peace negotiations. By all measures, the mission was a complete success. But Frida Nad's spirit still lingered, untouched and patient. And Ulic Qel-Droma carried away something more dangerous than any Sith artifact. He carried the seed of certainty that he was strong enough to study darkness without being consumed by it. That tiny seed, planted in the depths of an ancient tomb, would eventually grow into a tree of such terrible fruit that the entire galaxy would choke on its harvest. The brightest lights, after all, cast the darkest shadows. News of the Krath reached the Jedi Order like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, each wave carrying more disturbing implications than the last. The Empress Teta system had gone dark. Not literally, its sun still burned, its city still glittered against the void of space. But diplomatically, culturally, politically, it had sealed itself off from the Republic with sudden and absolute finality. Ships that approached were turned away by weapons platforms that hadn't existed months before. Communications were ignored. And refugees who managed to escape told stories of mass conversions, of nobility gathering in secret ceremonies where they learned to wield powers that made their eyes glow yellow in the darkness. Satel and Alima Keto had not been content to simply rule their inherited system. They had vision, they had ambition, and they had rediscovered Sith techniques for creating an army that needed neither food nor rest. Ancient war droids, constructed using a fusion of technology and dark side alchemy, began rolling off assembly lines in numbers that made Republic intelligence analysts grow pale. The Krath Holy Crusade began with surgical precision. Neighboring systems found their defense fleets overwhelmed by coordinated attacks that demonstrated military genius. Worlds that resisted were bombarded until their governments surrendered. Those that capitulated quickly were absorbed into the growing Krath Empire with surprising gentleness. Satal proved himself a brilliant strategist. Alima provided the mystical power that made their warriors believe they were invincible. Within a year, a dozen systems had fallen. The Republic Senate debated endlessly about intervention, about sovereignty, about whether this was truly their concern. While politicians argued, the Krath expanded. The Jedi could not afford such paralysis. Grand Master Rodan keeper of the Jedi archives and one of the oldest living masters, called for a convocation. Every Jedi who could be spared from their duties was summoned to the moon Deneba, orbiting the peaceful world of Onderon. Thousands answered the call. Knights and masters, Padawans and archivists, warriors and healers, the greatest gathering of Jedi in living memory, assembled to discuss a single question. How do you fight darkness that wears the face of civilization? Ulic Qel-Droma arrived on Deneba with a heart both full and troubled. Full because Nomi Sunrider walked beside him, their relationship having deepened during the months since Onderon. They had not spoken vows, had not made promises that might conflict with Jedi teachings, but everyone who saw them together understood. The Force itself seemed to sing when they were near each other, their energies intertwining in ways that strengthened them both. Troubled because Master Arca had been growing weaker. Age was catching up with the ancient Arcanian, his steps slower, his breathing more labored. He still possessed wisdom beyond measure. But the body that housed that wisdom was failing. Ulic tried not to think about a future without his master's guidance. Tried and failed. The convocation gathered in massive amphitheaters, carved from Deneba's stone. Jedi filled the seats in waves of brown and tan robes, their lightsabers creating a forest of cylinders at their belts. The air hummed with concentrated force energy, thousands of attuned minds, creating a resonance that could be felt for miles. Master Thorn, an ancient Toon whose appearance resembled a cross between reptile and mammal, spoke of the dark side's seductive nature. Master Vodo Siosk Bars, who carried a wooden staff instead of a lightsaber, warned against underestimating the Krath simply because they were new to the Force. Master Arca stood with difficulty and spoke of Frieden Nad, of how Sith influence could persist for centuries if not properly extinguished. And Ulic listened. He listened and he grew frustrated. The masters spoke of caution, of study, of understanding before action. But systems were falling, people were dying. How many more would suffer while the Jedi debated philosophy? During a break in the proceedings, Ulic walked with Nomi through Deneba's gardens. She held his hand, feeling the tension in him through their force bond. Her daughter Vima, now old enough to run and play, chased insects through the grass while her mother and Ulic talked in low voices. Nomi expressed concerns about the growing darkness, not just the Kryth, but something deeper. She had been having dreams, visions of shadows spreading across the galaxy like spilled ink. In these dreams she reached for Ulic but couldn't quite touch him, as if some invisible barrier had formed between them. He reassured her. His confidence was absolute. They were Jedi. They had the light. How could darkness prevail against such numbers, such training, such dedication? She wanted to believe him, but the dreams persisted. The attack came without warning. During the third day of convocation, Krath war droids, hundreds of them, dropped from orbit in armored pods that streaked through Deneba's atmosphere like falling stars. They landed in perfect formation surrounding the amphitheaters, their weapons already charging, their targeting systems locking onto force signatures. Red blaster fire erupted from 1,000 barrels simultaneously. The peaceful gathering transformed into a war zone in the space between heartbeats. Jedi who had been deep in meditation suddenly found themselves diving for cover, their lightsabers igniting mid-roll. Those who reacted slowly died in the first volley, their bodies crumpling before they fully understood they were under attack. Ulic's blade was in his hand before conscious thought, his body, moving on instinct, honed through years of training. Ki fought beside him, the brothers falling into practiced patterns, one covering while the other struck. Their lightsabers became blue blurs, deflecting blaster bolts back at their sources, creating small islands of safety in the chaos. But there were too many droids, too many angles of attack. The Jedi were powerful, but they were not warriors by nature. Many had spent decades in libraries, their combat skills theoretical rather than practical. The Kryth had planned this assault, knowing exactly who would be present, had calibrated their forces to overwhelm even concentrated Jedi defense. Master Arca fought in the center of the firestorm, his ancient blade moving with deceptive speed, his presence a rallying point for the younger Jedi. Ulic saw his master and began fighting his way toward him, needing to be near the man who had raised him. He was 50 meters away when it happened. A Krath droid, damaged but functional, its chassis smoking from lightsaber strikes, raised its weapon toward a group of Padawans frozen in fear. Master Arca saw the children in danger. Without hesitation, the ancient Jedi threw himself between the droid and its targets, his blade intercepting the first blast. The second shot got through, then the third. Ulic's scream tore through the force itself. He covered the remaining distance in seconds that felt like hours, his blade taking the droid apart with strikes powered by pure anguish. But it was too late. It had always been too late. Master Arca-Jeth lay on Deneba's grass, his robes darkening with blood, his breathing shallow. Ulic fell to his knees beside the only father he had truly known, cradling the ancient head in his lap. Around them the battle still raged, but for Ulic the universe had contracted to a single point. The old master's eyes found his student's face. Even dying, there was peace in that gaze, peace and concern. Arca's voice was barely a whisper. He spoke of pride in his students, of love for both brothers, and then with his last strength, he spoke a warning. "Beware certainty," he said. "Beware the belief that you cannot fall. The dark side does not announce itself. It justifies. It rationalizes. It makes evil feel like necessity." Ulic promised he would remember, promised he would honor his master's teachings, promised things he would break before the year was done. Master Arca-Jeth died in his student's arms, his spirit joining the force with a ripple that every Jedi on Deneba felt simultaneously. The battle ended shortly after, the remaining droids destroyed or retreating, but the victory was hollow. Dozens of Jedi lay dead, hundreds more were wounded, and one of their greatest masters was gone. The funeral on Ossus drew even more Jedi than the convocation had. Master Arca's body was laid to rest in gardens he had walked for decades, beneath trees that would grow from the nutrients his form provided. It was the Jedi way, returning to the Force in both spirit and substance. Ulic stood at the grave's edge beside Qel, both brothers silent, both drowning in grief that threatened to become something darker. Nomi stood close by with Vima, offering support through presence rather than words. She watched Ulic's face and saw something that frightened her. His grief was transforming, crystallizing, becoming hard and sharp and dangerous. After the ceremony, Ulic called together a group of Jedi he trusted. His proposal was radical, controversial, perhaps insane. He would infiltrate the Krath by posing as a fallen Jedi. He would gain their trust, learn their secrets, sabotage their operations from within. And when he had gathered enough intelligence, he would strike from the inside, collapsing their entire organization. Qel immediately opposed the plan. The risk was too great. The dark side too seductive. Their master had just warned against exactly this kind of certainty. But Ulic was adamant. He believed completely in his ability to resist corruption. He had studied the Sith texts. He understood the mechanisms of the dark side. He would be vigilant. He would be careful. He would not fall. The Jedi Council debated for hours. Some supported the plan, seeing no other way to stop the Krath expansion. Others called it suicide, a guarantee that they would lose Ulic as surely as they had lost Arca. In the end, they granted reluctant approval, swayed by Ulic's passionate argument and the desperate military situation. Nomi begged him not to go. She held him in Ossus Gardens the night before his departure, and pleaded. Her visions had grown worse. In her dreams she saw him standing in darkness so complete that his features were invisible, only his eyes visible, burning yellow like twin suns in a black void. Ulic kissed her forehead and promised he would return, promised that no darkness could hold him, promised that his love for her was stronger than any temptation. He meant every word, and every word was a lie he didn't yet know he was telling. The next morning, Ulic Qel-Droma departed Ossus alone in a small ship, heading for the Empress Teta system, heading for the Krath, heading, though he could not possibly know it, toward his own damnation. Behind him, Nomi watched his ship disappear into hyperspace, tears streaming down her face, feeling through the Force as if she was watching him die. She was not wrong. The Ulic Qel-Droma, who left Ossus that morning, would never return. In his place would come someone wearing his face, speaking with his voice, but hollowed out and filled with shadow. The fall had begun, And like all great tragedies, it started not with evil intentions but with noble ones twisted just slightly out of true. The city-planet of Sinagar glittered like a jewel floating in the void, its surface covered entirely by towers that reached towards space itself, their peaks disappearing into clouds while their bases descended into canyons so deep that sunlight never touched their floors. This was the capital of the Empress Theta system, heart of Krath power, and it was beautiful in the way that poisonous creatures are often beautiful. Dangerous, alluring, fatal to those who came too close. Ulic's ship descended through layers of air traffic, passing merchant vessels and pleasure craft, military destroyers bristling with weapons and gilded yachts carrying aristocrats to their floating estates. He had disabled his ship's Republic transponder, filed false documentation claiming to be a mercenary from the Outer Rim. His Jedi robes were packed away. His lightsaber hung at his belt, but now it looked like mere trophy rather than sacred tool. The first phase of his plan was simple. Make noise, make himself visible, most importantly, make himself look dangerous enough to attract Krath attention, but not so dangerous they would simply kill him outright. He started in Sinagar's lower levels, places where the city's beautiful facade cracked to reveal rot beneath. He picked fights with Krath enforcers, making sure to win but also making sure witnesses escaped to report what they had seen. A warrior, powerful, skilled with both blade and force, calling himself a fallen Jedi, disillusioned with the Republic's weakness, seeking those who had the strength to actually use power rather than philosophize about it. Within days, his reputation reached the right ears. The summons came in the form of an invitation delivered by a Krath warrior who radiated dark side energy like heat from a fire. Alima Keto wished to meet this interesting newcomer. An invitation that was also clearly a command: refuse and die, accept and face judgment. Ulic accepted. The palace where Alima held court existed in Sinagar's highest levels, where the air was thin and cold and the view stretched to the curve of the planet itself. Its architecture deliberately evoked ancient Sith temples, all sharp angles and oppressive weight, designed to make visitors feel small and threatened. Alima Keto received him in a throne room where shadows pooled in corners despite bright lighting, as if darkness had become semi-solid in her presence. She was younger than Ulic expected, perhaps his own age, with features that would have been beautiful if not for the hunger that burned behind her eyes. She wore black robes that seemed to absorb light, and Sith amulets hung around her neck, pulsing with their own dim red glow. Her brother Satul stood beside the throne, studying Ulic with naked suspicion. Where Alima radiated seduction and power, Satul projected cold intelligence and paranoia. He saw threats everywhere because he had become a threat himself and knew what that looked like. Alima's first words were not questions but statements. She knew he was Jedi trained. She could feel it in his Force signature, in the way he moved, in the discipline that underlay even his attempt to seem undisciplined. She knew his appearance was likely deception. The only question was what kind of deception. Ulic played his role perfectly. Yes, he admitted, he had been a Jedi, had believed their teachings, had followed their rules like an obedient child. But then he watched the Republic debate while billions suffered. Watched the Jedi Council paralyze itself with philosophy, while darkness spread unchecked. Watched his own master die because the Order refused to act decisively. The lies flowed from his lips smooth as oil, each one a tiny compromise, each one necessary for the mission, each one staining him in ways he promised himself were temporary. Elena listened with growing fascination. She saw in Ulic something rare. A Jedi-trained warrior, educated in the light, but angry enough to consider alternatives. Most who came to the Krath were already broken, already twisted by bitterness or madness. Ulic appeared whole, functional, powerful. If she could truly convert him rather than simply break him, he would be worth 100 ordinary warriors. She made him an offer. Learn the Qel ways, study their techniques, see if the power they offered justified the price. If he remained unimpressed, he could leave. But she suspected that once he truly understood what the dark side made possible, he would never want to return to the Jedi's self-imposed limitations. It was a trap, obviously. The moment he agreed to study their ways, the moment he opened his mind to dark side instruction, the corruption would begin. Alima knew this. Sattel knew this. Even Ulic, if he was honest with himself, knew this. But he believed his training was armor, believed his understanding of Sith techniques would let him recognize corruption as it happened, believed he could walk through fire and emerge unburned because he was simply that strong. Pride, the oldest and most fatal of all Jedi failures. The teaching began in earnest. Alima herself became his instructor, spending hours each day demonstrating techniques that made his Jedi training seem like children playing with practice sabers. She showed him how to channel emotion through the Force, how anger could sharpen focus rather than cloud it, how fear could heighten awareness, how passion could amplify power to levels meditation alone could never achieve. Each lesson ended with the same question: are you not stronger now than you were this morning? And the terrible thing was that he was, objectively, measurably stronger. He could lift objects he had struggled with before, could sense presences at greater distances, could influence minds with barely a thought where before it had required concentration and effort. The dark side delivered everything it promised. That was its true horror. It was not a lie. It was a truth that cost everything to embrace. Ulic told himself he was only pretending, that he was learning these techniques to better understand the enemy, that he would return to Ossus with knowledge that would help the Jedi develop counter-strategies. The justifications were endless. The self-deception was complete. Weeks became months. Ulic's presence in the Qel hierarchy became normalized. Other members stopped questioning his loyalty. Alima trusted him enough to share actual strategic information, to involve him in planning military operations, to seek his tactical advice. And during this time, Sattel Keto watched, waited, plotted. He had never trusted the fallen Jedi, and nothing he observed changed his assessment. Sattel saw through the performance to the Jedi spy beneath. But Alima refused to hear his warnings, bewitched by Ulic's combination of power and apparent nobility. So Sattel made his own plans. The assassination attempt came during a feast celebrating recent Qel victories. Ulic lifted a wine glass to his lips, tasted something wrong beneath the sweet flavor, felt poison burning down his throat before he could react. Sith alchemy. Toxins designed specifically to kill Force sensitives by turning their own power against them. His body convulsed. His vision went dark. He felt himself falling, heard Alima's scream of rage, sensed rather than saw her turning on her cousin with fury that she had been defied. What happened next occurred in the space between life and death, where conscious choice becomes impossible and pure instinct takes control. Ulic reached for the Force to heal himself, but the light side techniques he knew worked too slowly. The poison was burning through his cells faster than meditation could repair, so he reached deeper, reached for power that came without restraint or limitation, reached for the dark side. And it answered. Oh, how it answered! Dark side energy flooded through him with an intensity that made his previous experiments seem like candle flames compared to a star going nova. It burned the poison from his system. It repaired damaged tissue. It kept his heart beating through sheer force of will projected through the Force. It saved his life. But life is not free. Everything has a price. And the dark side's price was carved directly into Ulic's spirit. He survived. rose from the floor where he had collapsed, looked at Quito with eyes that now held the faintest yellow tint, and in that moment, something fundamental changed. Some line that he had been walking carefully, certain he had not crossed it, turned out to be far behind him. Alema had Seitel imprisoned, but not executed. Even in her fury, she understood that killing her own cousin would fracture the crisis. But Ulic's position was now unassailable. He had survived an assassination attempt that should have killed him, proved his strength, proved his value, proved something else too, though only those watching carefully saw it. He had chosen survival over principle, had reached for dark power, not as experiment or deception, but as genuine necessity, and having done so once, the second time would be easier, and the third easier still, until eventually there would be no choice at all. The military campaigns began shortly after. The crisis launched new offensives, and Ulic Qel-Droma stood at Alema's side, his tactical genius now deployed for conquest rather than peacekeeping. He told himself he was gathering intelligence, learning their methods, preparing for the moment when he would betray them and bring everything crashing down. But the campaigns were his strategies. The victories were won through his planning, and when Republic forces died, they died following defensive positions he had predicted, walking into traps he had designed. His hands were stained with their blood, whether he admitted it or not. Communication with Nomi became irregular, then rare, then painful. Each time he touched the force to reach across the light years to her, he felt her recoil slightly, not consciously, not with intent, but she felt the darkness clinging to him like smoke, and her instincts as a Jedi made her pull away even as her heart wanted to pull closer. Kay grew concerned enough to mount a rescue operation. He led a team of Jedi infiltrating Synagogue, fighting through Krath security to reach his brother. When they finally stood face to face in a palace corridor, Kay barely recognized what he saw. Ulic's eyes held that yellow tint permanently. Now, his presence in the Force had changed, become colder, sharper, more aggressive. When he moved, there was a predatory quality that had not existed before. And when he spoke, his words carried the absolute certainty of someone who has stopped questioning themselves. Kai begged him to leave, to come home, to remember who he was. He spoke of their childhood, of Master Arca's teachings, of Nomi waiting on Asus, grief slowly killing her, as surely as any weapon. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in Ulic's eyes. Recognition, regret, the shadow of the man he had been. Kai saw it and reached out, certain he had broken through. Then Krath warriors arrived, and Ulic drew his lightsaber, not to escape with his brother, to defend his position, to attack the Jedi who had come to save him. The fight was brief and brutal. Ulic's blade moved with controlled fury, enhanced by techniques no Jedi knew. He did not kill his brother, but his restraint felt more like contempt than mercy. Kai retreated with his team, bearing wounds both physical and spiritual. As the Jedi ship fled into hyperspace, Ulic stood on a palace balcony watching it disappear. Alema joined him, placing her hand on his shoulder with possessive familiarity. She spoke of how well he had done, how completely he had left his old life behind, how powerful he was becoming. And Ulic, standing there with his brother's blood on his blade and darkness burning behind his eyes, told himself one more time that he was still in control, still pretending, still capable of returning to the light whenever he chose. The lie was almost perfect, so perfect that he believed it himself. While Ulic descended into shadow within Synagogue's glittering towers, another fall was unfolding across the galaxy, destined to intertwine with his in ways that would shatter civilizations. Exar Kun had been the most gifted student Master Vodosiask Baz ever trained. Where others struggled with basic Force techniques, Exar grasped them instinctively. His lightsaber skills bordered on precognitive. His scholarly mind absorbed texts that took others years to comprehend. By every measure, he was destined for greatness. But brilliance without wisdom is merely a sharper blade to wound yourself with. Exar burned with hunger. No amount of knowledge could satisfy. Each answer spawned 10 new questions. The Jedi taught patience. That understanding came through meditation. But Exar's impatience felt like fire in his veins. Why wait decades for wisdom when ancient texts already contained it? Why limit himself to light side techniques when Sith holocrons promised infinitely more? Master Voda recognized these warning signs. Pride masquerading as confidence, ambition disguised as dedication. He tried guiding his student away from these cliffs, but Exar had already decided his master's caution was merely fear of his potential. The breaking point came during a training duel. Vodo, armed only with his wooden staff, defeated Exar, despite the younger man wielding a lightsaber. The lesson was clear. Discipline and wisdom triumph over raw strength. Exar learned something entirely different. The Jedi artificially limited themselves. His master withheld knowledge that could make him unstoppable. Somewhere in the galaxy, forbidden teachings waited for someone bold enough to claim them. He departed the order without ceremony. Just a note thanking Vodo, while explaining that true students must eventually surpass their masters, and doing so required exploring paths the master feared to walk. Exar's journey led first to Onderon, where Frieden Nad's spirit found him easily. The young man's force presence burned like a beacon. All that power and ambition wrapped around wounded pride. Perfect, malleable, exactly what Nad needed. The ghost appeared in visions that blurred dream and reality. Nad spoke of the ancient Sith Empire, of Dark Lords who had mastered the Force to degrees that made Jedi teachings seem primitive, of tombs on sacred worlds where their secrets waited for one worthy enough to claim them. Exar followed these breadcrumbs deeper into darkness. On Korriban, ancient homeworld of the Sith, the Valley of the Dark Lords tested him brutally. Spirits invaded his mind with nightmares made real. They showed him 1,000 deaths, pushed him to madness's edge, and held him there, demanding he break or transcend breaking. He emerged transformed. Yellow eyes, cold Force signature. Powers the Jedi insisted didn't exist now coursing through him in ways that could never be undone. But Korriban was mere preparation. Nad guided him to Yavin 4, a remote jungle moon where the ancient Sith Lord Naga Sadow had built temples millennia ago. Massive structures designed to channel dark side energy, turning the entire moon into a weapon. The primitive Masasi still inhabited Yavin 4, their culture unchanged for thousands of years. When Exar arrived, they saw the return of ancient power. They knelt without being asked, offered service without reservation. Exar accepted their worship because he no longer saw beings as equals, only those with power and those without, those who commanded and those who obeyed. He set the Masasi to work expanding temples, preparing for rituals learned from spirits and holocrons. He experimented with Sith alchemy, twisting living flesh into new forms. Masasi volunteers became his subjects, warriors who considered transformation by their god the highest honor. He mutated them into creatures stronger and more savage, their minds simplified for combat, bodies enhanced through techniques that made biology into sculpture. Each success taught new possibilities. Each failure provided data, compassion. The Jedi claimed was essential to understanding the Force. But Exar discovered detachment worked equally well, perhaps better. Emotion clouded judgment. Power required clarity that came from viewing the galaxy with scientific coldness rather than sentimental warmth. Frieden Nad watched with satisfaction, but he understood something Exar hadn't yet grasped. Singular power was fragile. History proved this repeatedly. Lone Sith Lords rose, conquered, then fell when the galaxy united against them. Lasting change required multiplication. 2 Dark Lords, not one. Alliance, not isolation. So Nad whispered to Exar about Ulic Qel-Droma, a Jedi infiltrating the Krath who found himself seduced by the darkness he studied. A warrior whose tactical genius matched Exar's scholarly brilliance. Someone whose fall was nearly complete, but who still pretended he served the light. And Nad whispered to Ulic about Exar Kun, a former Jedi who embraced Sith teachings without hesitation. A scholar commanding powers that made Krath sorcery seem like tricks. Someone who had claimed the title Ulic was too proud to acknowledge he desired. Dark Lord of the Sith. Nad arranged their meeting with manipulative skill. Both were led to believe his deepest secrets waited in his tomb on Dexon Moon. Both arrived expecting to claim knowledge. Both found an enemy instead. Words became threats. Threats became violence that shook Dexon's jungles with force energy, sending wildlife fleeing for miles. Their lightsabers met with impacts, creating shockwaves. Blue against blue, both still carrying Jedi weapons, neither yet forging traditional Sith red crystals. They moved through forms and counters, each recognizing shared foundation, corrupted in different but equally effective ways. Ulic fought with passionate intensity, channeling suppressed emotion into every strike. Exar fought with cold precision, attacks calculated for maximum efficiency, perfectly matched. The duel raged through ancient ruins, both drawing on darkness until air crackled with raw power. Then the tomb split open. Ancient Sith spirits emerged, called by concentrated dark side energy. They coalesced into semi-solid forms, wraiths who had been Dark Lords, whose names were carved into history itself. Marka Ragnos materialized, largest and most imposing, towering figure wrapped in shadow robes, face hidden behind a mask. His voice resonated directly into their minds, bypassing ears entirely. The proclamation was simple. Both warriors were worthy. Both had proven themselves. Both would serve the Sith. But hierarchy must be established, not through this duel, which could continue endlessly without resolution, but through acknowledging who had embraced darkness most completely. Exar Kun was named Dark Lord of the Sith. He had sought power deliberately, studied systematically, transformed through conscious choice rather than gradual corruption. His mastery exceeded anything seen in generations. Ulic Qel-Droma was named Apprentice and War Commander. His tactical genius was acknowledged, power recognized, but his heart remained conflicted. He served darkness while believing himself capable of returning to light, valuable, but not supreme. Ulic wanted to rage against this judgment, but something deeper, some remnant of Jedi wisdom, recognized truth. Exar had fully committed. Ulic still played a role he no longer controlled. He accepted. Knelt beside Exar, before Marka Ragnos, spoke vows that would have horrified who he'd been months ago, embraced fully the identity he'd been pretending to inhabit. The Sith Brotherhood was born, 2 Dark Lords commanding different strengths, united in purpose if not trust. They would reshape the galaxy, bring the Jedi Order to its knees, prove light side dominance was merely historical accident waiting correction. Freedon Nad, believing himself indispensable, began speaking of his authority, how they would serve his vision, plans nurtured for centuries. Exar and Ulic looked at each other. No words necessary. Nad had been useful, teacher and guide. The bridge leading to this power. But bridges once crossed served no further purpose. Together they grasped his spirit with techniques he'd taught them. They tore it apart. His scream echoed across Dexon as his essence, scattered into particles too small to maintain coherence, erased so completely even memory would fade. Other Sith spirits watched this execution with approval. Nad had overstayed his relevance. These new Dark Lords understood the crucial lesson. Power respects only power. Gratitude is weakness. The alliance was sealed through shared murder of their creator. They departed understanding. They were now the darkness incarnate, not serving it, not channeling it, being it. Exar returned to Yavin 4 to accelerate his work. Temples would become fortresses. Masasi would become army. He would begin his most ambitious project, corrupting Jedi to his cause, building a brotherhood of dark-siders that would overwhelm the light through superior numbers and technique. Ulic returned to Sinagar without pretense. No more claiming infiltrator status. No more fiction about gathering intelligence. He was Sith, war commander of an empire that didn't yet exist, but would be carved from the Republic's corpse. The Great Sith War was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and billions would die before its end. Exar Kun understood something about corruption that Frieden had never had. You didn't break Jedi through torture or intimidation. You seduced them with the one thing their training specifically denied. Choice. Real choice. Unconstrained by council wisdom or ancient tradition. His first target was the Great Jedi Library on Ossus, where young Jedi studied under Master Ood Banner. The ancient Neti, a tree-like being who measured age in centuries, presided over collections representing millennia of accumulated wisdom. Exar arrived not as conqueror, but as scholar. He requested access to Sith texts in restricted archives. When Master Ood refused, Exar didn't threaten. Instead, he turned to the students watching. He spoke of freedom, of artificial limitations on their potential, how the council treated them like children who couldn't be trusted, keeping them weak through deliberate ignorance. Was knowledge itself evil, or did evil come from how knowledge was applied? If the latter, shouldn't they be allowed to make their own moral choices? The students, young and hungry for advancement, heard validation of doubts they'd never been allowed to voice. Their training emphasized obedience. Trust masters. Follow the code. Don't question. But Exar asked why. Why trust? Why obey? Why limit yourself when the Force itself was limitless? Several students, including a Cather named Crado, found themselves nodding. The arguments made sense, felt liberating in ways the code never had. Master Rush sensed his students wavering and tried intervening, but damage was done. Seeds planted. Given time, they'd grow poison fruit. Exar departed without violence, leaving confusion and doubt. He'd return for students who listened most intently. But first, they needed time to question, to argue with masters, to feel friction between teachings and what now seemed self-evident. Crado's wife Silvar watched her husband grow distant over following weeks. Their once unshakable bond developed cracks as Crado studied Sith philosophy, seeking to understand why Jedi dismissed such powerful techniques. He told himself he was being academic. Objective, the lies we tell ourselves are always most believable. When Exar returned to Ossus, he came at night, broadcasting a subtle force call only receptive minds would hear. Crado felt it like a hook in his chest, pulling him from bed while Silvar slept. He followed without questioning, drawn to a clearing where other students waited, all confused but excited. Exar taught techniques the Jedi considered forbidden. Nothing overtly evil, no murder or torture, simply ways of channeling emotion through force, accessing power meditation alone could never provide. They felt it immediately, the surge of capability, intoxicating sensation of becoming more. By dawn, Exar had converted 6 Jedi, not through coercion, but by offering exactly what they wanted. Permission to be powerful without limitation. By week's end, a dozen followers. By month's end, entire groups were leaving Ossus to join his brotherhood on Yavin 4. Master Bana watched this exodus with grief deeper than words. Each lost student felt like personal failure. He attempted barring the archives, preventing more knowledge corruption, but students no longer asked permission. They took what they wanted, and when he tried stopping them physically, they attacked, not to kill their old master, but with casual disregard for his authority that hurt worse than blades. Solvar remained loyal to light, but Krado's defection burned like poison. She blamed Exar-kun for stealing her husband. But deeper, more honestly, she blamed Ulic Qel-Droma, the war commander who legitimized Sith resurgence through his own fall. If a Jedi as respected as Ulic could turn, what hope did younger, less disciplined students have? Her grief would metastasize into hatred, and hatred, given time, would demand blood. Meanwhile, Ulic commanded military operations from Sinagar with effectiveness that baffled Republic strategists. Cracked forces, supplemented by resources from Exar's controlled systems, operated with coordination suggesting shared intelligence and unified command. The Mandalorian clans presented the next strategic piece. These warrior cultures scattered across multiple systems possessed fighting traditions dating back millennia. They valued strength above all, honor through combat, glory through victory. But they had no unified purpose, no leader capable of bringing disparate clans under single banner. Ulic provided both. He traveled to Mandalorian space with an offer: serve the Sith and access targets worthy of their skills, refuse and remain fragmented, raiding trade routes while history passed them by. But Mandalorians wouldn't follow based on words. They required proof. Their leader, Mandalore the Indomitable, demanded single combat. Ulic against Mandalore, traditional weapons, fight to submission or death. Victor commands, loser serves or dies. Simple, clean, honest in ways political maneuvering never was. The arena was ancient, carved into an asteroid, open to vacuum, so combatants fought with stars as witness. Hundreds of Mandalorians gathered, armor gleaming, anticipation palpable. Mandalore fought with weapons refined over generations, vibroblade cutting through nearly anything, wrist-mounted blasters, grappling techniques from culture considering warfare the highest art. Ulic fought with lightsaber and force, but deliberately restrained himself. He could have crushed Mandalore's windpipe with telekinesis, shattered armor through force push, ended it in seconds with Sith lightning. Exar had taught him. Instead, he engaged on Mandalore's terms. Blade against blade, skill against skill, letting warrior culture see he respected their traditions enough to honor them. The fight lasted nearly an hour. Both bleeding, both pushed to limits. Ulic's Jedi training gave slight edge. He disarmed Mandalore, held blade to throat, offered choice: serve or die. Mandalore the Indomitable laughed, deep, genuine, appreciative, then knelt, not in submission, but recognition. Here was a warrior worthy of following, someone combining power with honor, who could have won easily but chose the harder path. Such restraint demonstrated greater strength than overwhelming force. The clans united under Mandalore, who swore fealty to Ulic Qel-Droma. Suddenly Sith forces gained thousands of the galaxy's most effective warriors, each worth 10 regular soldiers. Power balance shifted dramatically in a single afternoon. Republic analysts, watching Mandalorian raids begin in earnest, realized with horror this wasn't random pillaging. This was coordinated strategy. Supply lines targeted, shipyards destroyed, defense fleets drawn out and ambushed. Someone with intimate Republic military knowledge was systematically dismantling their response capability. That someone was Ulic. The same tactical genius who once defended the Republic now worked to destroy it. He knew their communications protocols, understood their strategic thinking, could predict responses because he'd helped develop the doctrines they followed. Worlds began falling. Not through overwhelming force but precision strikes, collapsing local governments, leaving populations too terrified to resist. Krath occupation was surprisingly benign. Cooperate and life continued mostly unchanged. Resist and face consequences, making cooperation seem paradise. Xr's brotherhood grew in size and capability. His dark Jedi trained in Yavin temples, learning techniques, making them individually more powerful than equivalent Jedi. Not constrained by guilt or hesitation, channeling fear and anger efficiently, killing when necessary without trauma or remorse. More importantly, they truly believed the Sith way represented evolution rather than corruption, that they weren't falling to darkness, but rising above artificial limitations. This conviction made them dangerous beyond mere power. Warriors fighting for payment flee when odds turn. Zealots fighting for ideology die rather than retreat. The Republic Senate finally acknowledged crisis when dozens of systems petitioned simultaneously for military protection. Debates that paralyzed them for months suddenly seemed criminally irresponsible. They authorized emergency powers, mobilized defense fleets, called every available Jedi to serve as generals. The Jedi Council understood this wasn't simple war, but existential threat. If the Sith triumphed, the Order might be extinguished entirely. 10,000 years of wisdom lost, Lightside's galactic voice silenced. Onassis Master Udbana made desperate decisions. He began transferring crucial holocrons and texts to hidden locations. If the Great Library fell, at least some knowledge would survive. The ancient Nasi worked ceaselessly, feeling through force that catastrophe approached with gravity's inevitability. Nomi Sunrider trained harder than ever, pushing herself and daughter Vima to new capability levels. She understood she'd face Ulic. Eventually, the thought filled her with dread and determination equally. Hart still loved who he'd been, but the warrior he'd become needed stopping, and she'd do what duty required even if it destroyed her emotionally. Across the galaxy, countless personal tragedies played out. Families separated by battle lines, friends on opposite sides, Jedi facing former classmates now serving Sith. Every war contains personal tragedies, but this felt different. Not nation against nation, or species against species, philosophy against philosophy, light against darkness. The Force itself as prize. At the center, coordinating strategy across dozens of worlds, Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma planned their ultimate move, the operation that would bring the Republic to its knees, force Jedi Council surrender, or watch civilization burn. They would strike Coruscant itself, the capital, the symbol, the heart. When it fell, the galaxy would understand the Jedi Age was ending, and the Sith Age had begun. The campaigns that followed rewrote Republic strategic doctrine and revealed how fragile their defenses truly were. Ulic's brilliance lay not in brute force but surgical precision. He understood that conquering required more than destroying enemy militaries. It demanded breaking their will to resist while preserving infrastructure valuable for governance. Terror and mercy deployed in calculated balance, each reinforcing the other's effectiveness. The Outer Rim fell first. Remote systems lacking substantial defense fleets, dependent on Republic protection that couldn't arrive fast enough. Mandalorian drop ships descended without warning, their warriors moving through cities with practiced efficiency. Resistance met overwhelming force. Surrender met surprisingly reasonable terms. Within weeks, populations learned cooperation meant survival. Each conquest provided resources for the next. Shipyards were seized intact, immediately repurposed to produce Krath vessels. Recruitment centers opened, offering displaced soldiers employment under new management. Many accepted. Unemployment or warfare were poor alternatives to steady pay and clear command structure. Republic intelligence struggled to predict Ulic's movements because he deliberately created patterns, then broke them. 3 systems attacked in sequence suggested linear advance. So Republic concentrated forces to block the obvious 4th target. Ulic struck the opposite direction, taking 2 systems while they defended empty space. He knew their response times, knew which admirals favored aggressive tactics versus defensive positioning, knew which senators would demand protection for their home systems regardless of strategic value. Human behavior became tactical data, exploited with the same precision he applied to fleet movements. The Battle of Foros demonstrated his approach's devastating effectiveness. The massive orbital shipyards represented Republic's primary naval construction capacity. Losing them would cripple fleet replacement for years. So they defended Foros with everything available, convinced Ulic would eventually attempt its capture. He did, but not through direct assault. Mandalorian commandos infiltrated the station over months, posing as workers, repair technicians, merchants. When Ulic's fleet arrived, it faced expected heavy resistance. The battle raged for hours, neither side gaining advantage, exactly as Republic strategists predicted. Then the shipyards themselves turned traitor. Mandalorian infiltrators seized control of defensive batteries, turning station weapons against defending ships. Chaos erupted. Ships that survived initial barrage fled in disorder. Foros fell with minimal damage to its facilities, immediately becoming Sith Naval Production Center. The psychological impact exceeded tactical value. If Foros could fall through infiltration, what other facilities had been compromised? Paranoia spread through Republic commands. Resources were diverted to internal security, weakening frontline forces, exactly as Ulic intended. Mandalore the Indomitable proved himself invaluable beyond combat prowess. His warriors brought discipline forged through generations of warrior culture. They didn't loot or brutalize conquered populations unnecessarily. Violence served purpose, never indulgence. This restraint made occupied populations less likely to mount resistance. More crucially, Mandalore understood logistics. Armies marched on supply lines. He organized convoy protection, established depot networks, ensured troops remained equipped and fed. Boring work that glory-seeking warriors typically ignored, but Mandalore knew wars were won through supply management as much as battlefield courage. The Mandalorian Crusade became legendary not just for victories, but for how those victories were achieved. They struck with such speed that defense fleets arrived to find battles already concluded. They adapted tactics constantly, never using the same approach twice consecutively. They fought with honor that made even enemies respect them, understanding these weren't monsters but warriors serving what they believed was righteous cause. Ulic commanded this machine with growing confidence. Each victory validated his strategic choices. Each successful operation demonstrated his value to the Sith cause. The nagging doubt that occasionally surfaced, whispers suggesting he'd become what he once fought against, were drowned by tangible evidence of effectiveness. He justified each action through military necessity. Destroying that convoy prevented weapons reaching Republic forces. Conquering this system denied enemy strategic position. The rationalizations were endless. The self-deception was complete. Meanwhile, Exar Kun's Dark Jedi Brotherhood conducted their own operations, where Mandalorians took territory. Dark Jedi hunted Republic Force users. Jedi Knights found themselves ambushed by former friends who now wielded Sith techniques with terrifying proficiency. These encounters rarely ended in capture. Dark Jedi fought to kill. Understanding mercy was weakness their enemies would exploit. The coordination between Ulic's conventional forces and Exar's Force users created synergy neither could achieve alone. Mandalorians softened targets through military pressure. Dark Jedi eliminated key defenders through assassination. Populations surrendered before realizing they'd been defeated through combined arms approach unprecedented in galactic warfare. Republic Senate sessions became exercises in barely controlled panic. Representatives from threatened systems demanded protection. Those from occupied territories begged for liberation. Military commanders requested resources that didn't exist. The Chancellor struggled maintaining order, while private meetings discussed previously unthinkable options: negotiated surrender, partition, anything to stop the bleeding. The Jedi Council watched their order stretched impossibly thin. Masters who should have been teaching were instead commanding battle groups. Padawans barely finished training were thrust into combat. Knights died in numbers that made every loss a tragedy compounded by desperation. They needed more time, more preparation, more everything. Time was the one resource their enemies denied them. Ulic's personal role evolved from commander to legend. Soldiers on both sides spoke his name with mixture of fear and awe. Republic troops who survived encounters described warrior moving with inhuman speed, deflecting blaster bolts, while simultaneously directing tactical operations. Sith forces saw him as invincible, their belief in his abilities becoming self-fulfilling prophecy. But wars are not won through tactical brilliance alone. Strategic objectives require political will to maintain, and Ulic's ultimate goal wasn't conquering the Outer Rim. That was merely preparation. The true target, the objective that would break Republic resistance and force Jedi surrender, required attacking the one place considered impregnable: Coruscant, the capital world. Ecumenopolis covered entirely by cities stretching from poles to equator. Home to the Senate, the Supreme Chancellor, and population numbering in the trillions, defended by the largest concentration of military forces in known space. Attacking Coruscant violated every tactical principle. Defending forces outnumbered potential attackers by factors making victory mathematically impossible. Orbital defenses could destroy fleets before they reached engagement range. Even landing troops successfully, holding ground against endless reinforcements, was fantasy. Every strategist agreed Coruscant was unassailable through conventional assault, which was precisely why Ulic planned to attack it. Not to conquer, not to hold, but to demonstrate that nowhere was safe, that the Republic's heart could be reached, that symbols were merely symbols, vulnerable like everything else. The operation's success didn't require military victory. It required political humiliation, proof that Republic couldn't protect even its capital. Once that seed of doubt was planted, once populations understood their government was powerless, resistance would crumble across the galaxy. Exar Kun agreed with the strategy. He would provide dark Jedi support while Ulic led Mandalorian and Krath forces. Together, they would strike at galactic civilization's symbolic center. Together, they would prove the age of Republic was ending. Preparations proceeded in absolute secrecy. Fleet movements were disguised as routine deployments. Troops were told they were training for entirely different operations. Only Ulic, Exar, and Mandalore knew the true objective. When the order finally came, when fleets began their hyperspace jumps toward Coruscant, Ulic stood on his flagship's bridge, watching stars streak past. Part of him, some distant remnant of who he'd been, whispered that this was wrong, that attacking the capital meant abandoning any pretense of noble purpose. He silenced that whisper through familiar justification. The Republic was corrupt. The Jedi were blind. Someone had to remake civilization, and power was the only language civilizations understood. Every conqueror in history had told themselves similar lies. Most had believed them. The fleet dropped from hyperspace at Coruscant's edge. Alarms screamed across the planet's surface. Defense fleets scrambled to intercept. Jedi rushed to defensive positions, and Ulic, Qel-Droma, fallen Jedi Knight, war commander of the Sith, led his forces into battle against the very government he had once sworn to protect. The invasion of Coruscant had begun. The Sith Armada emerged from hyperspace like a nightmare made manifest. Hundreds of warships, Kryth vessels alongside Mandalorian cruisers, their weapons already charging as they dropped into real space at the edge of Coruscant's defensive perimeter. Republic defense fleets scrambled with practiced efficiency, but even their best response times couldn't match the speed of Ulic's assault. His forces didn't pause to establish formations or coordinate approaches. They simply accelerated toward the planet, accepting casualties as acceptable cost of momentum. Orbital battle stations opened fire, their massive turbolasers carving through Sith vessels with precision born from centuries of defensive preparation. Ships exploded in brilliant spheres of expanding gas and debris, but for every destroyer that died, 2 more pushed through the defensive screen. Mandalorian pilots flew with suicidal courage, their fighters weaving through fire that should have been impossible to survive. Ulic's flagship, the Kryth vessel he'd named Justice's Fall in deliberate mockery of his former ideals, drove straight through the heaviest concentration of defensive fire. Its shields flared white-hot, nearly failing, but held long enough to reach orbital insertion range. Drop pods launched by the thousands, streaking through atmosphere toward the Senate district like falling stars carrying damnation. Republic military commanders watched their tactical displays with growing horror. The attack wasn't designed for conquest, it was a decapitation strike. Every pod trajectory led toward government centers, military headquarters, locations where killing leadership would create maximum chaos. Jedi defenders gathered at the Senate building, dozens of masters and knights forming defensive perimeter. They could feel Ulic's presence approaching through the Force, a cold star of concentrated darkness that made even experienced masters suppress involuntary shudders. This wasn't the young idealist they'd trained alongside. This was something that wore his face while burning with power that felt fundamentally wrong. The drop pods impacted across the Senate district within seconds of each other. Hatches blew open. Mandalorian shock troops poured out in perfect formation, their armor painted in colors denoting clan affiliation, their weapons tracking for targets before their boots touched ground. And Ulic came with them, not hiding safely aboard his flagship, but leading from the front, his lightsaber ignited before he'd fully emerged from his pod. Blue blade, still, he hadn't forged a Sith weapon. Perhaps some part of him couldn't quite bring himself to complete that final symbolic transformation. The Jedi moved to intercept. Masters who had known Ulic personally tried reaching him through the Force, broadcasting feelings of concern and hope that he could still turn back. He responded by attacking with such focused fury that they barely raised defenses in time. His fighting style had evolved beyond anything Jedi training encompassed. He channeled rage without losing control, used fear to sharpen reflexes rather than cloud judgment, struck with aggression that somehow remained precise and calculated. Dark side techniques woven seamlessly into forms Master Arca had taught him, creating hybrid approach that made him nearly impossible to predict. The battle raged through corridors designed for political debate, not warfare. Lightsabers carved through ornate architecture. Blaster fire scarred walls decorated with artwork from 100 worlds. Mandalorians fought with disciplined efficiency, not killing unnecessarily, but advancing inexorably toward their objectives. Tot Daneta, the Twi'lek Jedi, who had fought beside Ulic on Onderon, intercepted his former friend in an intersection corridor. For a moment, just a moment, their eyes met and recognition flickered. Tot spoke Ulic's name softly, pleading without words for acknowledgement of their shared history. Ulic's response was a force push that sent Tot crashing through a wall, his body embedding in duraplast and metal, not killed, but removed from the fight with casual contempt that hurt worse than any blade. Other Jedi who had known him received similar treatment, not execution but dismissal, as if they were no longer worth the effort of genuine combat. This surgical cruelty demonstrated how completely he had transformed. The Ulic they knew would have struggled with fighting friends. This version barely considered them obstacles. Republic troops rallied around the Senate chamber itself, determined to prevent enemy forces from reaching the Supreme Chancellor. They fought with desperate courage, knowing failure meant galactic government's symbolic heart would be violated. Mandalorians respected that courage even as they systematically dismantled defensive positions. Then everything changed. The Krath fleet, under Alima Keto's direct command, suddenly ceased fire. Ships that had been providing orbital bombardment support went silent. Mandalorian ground commanders received confused reports that their supply vessels were withdrawing, leaving them without reinforcement capacity. Ulic felt the shift through his tactical awareness before understanding its cause. Something was wrong. Alima had betrayed him. The truth was simpler and more petty than strategic calculation. Alima had watched Ulic hesitate when facing Nomi Sunrider in previous encounters, had seen the way his absolute certainty cracked when confronted by the woman he'd once loved. Jealousy, that most human of weaknesses, had festered into treacherous rage. She'd made contact with Republic negotiators, offering to withdraw Krath forces in exchange for amnesty and territorial concessions. Not because she cared about those terms, but because humiliating Ulic mattered more than victory. If he died on Coruscant, abandoned by the forces he commanded, her position as Krath leader would be uncontested. Republic forces, sensing opportunity in sudden enemy confusion, counterattacked with renewed ferocity. Mandalorians, realizing they'd been left exposed without fleet support, began fighting withdrawal toward extraction points. They refused to rout, even betrayed, but tactical reality demanded retreat. Ulic stood in the Senate rotunda, surrounded by converging Republic forces, understanding with perfect clarity what had occurred. Alima's betrayal, his own miscalculation in trusting someone whose loyalty was always conditional, the operation's failure despite coming within meters of his objective. He could have fought his way out, could have killed everyone between himself and freedom, carved path through defenders with nothing but rage and power. Part of him wanted exactly that, wanted to paint these halls with blood until his fury was satisfied. But something stopped him, some calculation that penetrated even through dark side intoxication. Dying here accomplished nothing. Being captured, however, might create opportunities. Martyrdom held certain appeal, but strategic value remained in survival. So when Republic Special Forces surrounded him, weapons trained from every angle, stun grenades already primed, he deactivated his lightsaber. The blade retracted with that distinctive snap that signaled surrender. They bound him with force-suppressing restraints, technology designed specifically for capturing dangerous force sensitives. The cuffs burned against his wrists, their energy field disrupting his connection to the power that had defined him. Suddenly, he was just a man, exhausted, wounded, captured. The Senate chamber erupted in chaos as news spread. The fallen Jedi, architect of so much devastation, had been taken prisoner. Calls for immediate execution competed with demands for public trial. The Supreme Chancellor struggled maintaining order while privately feeling relief so profound it bordered on weakness. They dragged Ulic before emergency Senate session, still in his battle-damaged armor, blood from minor wounds staining his clothes. Senators who had fled at his approach now returned to hurl accusations. Representatives from conquered worlds demanded justice. Those from systems still free insisted on making examples that would discourage future rebellions. Ulic said nothing. His silence was more unnerving than defiance would have been. He simply stood there, bound and powerless, watching proceedings with eyes that held neither remorse nor fear, only calculation, only patience. The trial began immediately. Driven by political necessity to demonstrate Republic strength, evidence was presented of atrocities committed under his command. Witnesses testified about destroyed worlds, murdered populations, Jedi killed through his strategies. The accounting of his crimes took hours, each revelation more damning than the last. Through it all, Ulic remained silent. He didn't deny charges, didn't attempt justification. When asked directly if he acknowledged responsibility, he met the Chancellor's eyes and spoke his first words since capture. Yes, that single word carried more weight than any speech. Unrepentant acknowledgement, acceptance of what he'd done without pretense of regret. The Senate recoiled from such absolute absence of conscience. Nomi Sunrider watched from the gallery, her daughter Vima beside her. The girl, now approaching adolescence, couldn't reconcile stories of the noble Jedi her mother had loved with this cold figure accepting damnation without flinching. Nomi herself struggled with warring emotions. Part of her still loved who Ulic had been. Part of her wanted him dead for what he'd become. The verdict was unanimous. Death. Execution to be carried out within the week. Public broadcast across the Republic as demonstration that even fallen Jedi faced justice. Ulic was returned to maximum security detention, placed in cell designed to hold Force users. Energy fields suppressed his abilities. Guards rotated constantly to prevent familiarity or sympathy. He was watched every moment, denied privacy, treated not as prisoner, but as dangerous artifact requiring containment. And still, he waited, patient, certain of something the Republic didn't understand. Exar Kun had not abandoned him. The Dark Lord of the Sith was coming, and when he arrived, Coruscant would burn in ways the failed invasion had only suggested. Days passed. Ulic's execution was scheduled and publicized. The galaxy watched, holding collective breath, waiting to see justice delivered against architect of so much suffering. Then, on the morning of his scheduled death, Exar Kun arrived, not with fleets or armies, just himself and handful of his most powerful Dark Jedi. They descended on Coruscant like wrath incarnate, moving through defenses as if they didn't exist. Where Republic forces gathered, Exar scattered them with casual waves of Force power that sent bodies flying like leaves in hurricane. The courthouse where Ulic awaited execution became ground zero for devastation. Exar Kun walked through its front entrance, killing guards who attempted stopping him with such effortless efficiency that others simply fled rather than face similar fate. Master Vodo Siosk Bardus, Exar's former teacher, had been summoned to Coruscant specifically for this possibility. The ancient being confronted his fallen student in the courthouse's main hall, lightsaber against staff, master against apprentice one final time. Their duel was brief and heartbreaking. Vodo fought with every technique he'd ever mastered, drawing on decades of experience and wisdom. But Exar had surpassed him, grown beyond anything the master could match. The wooden staff, which had once demonstrated discipline's triumph over power, shattered under sustained assault. Exar Kun's blade pierced Vodo's chest. The old master fell without sound, his final expression one of profound sadness rather than pain. He'd failed his student, failed to prevent this transformation, failed to save someone he'd loved like a son. Exar stepped over the body without pause, proceeding to Ulic's cell. The force fields deactivated at his approach. Restraints fell away like they were made of paper. The two Dark Lords stood face to face, their alliance strained but holding. They fought their way out together, leaving trail of bodies and devastation. Republic forces that tried stopping them were swept aside. Jedi who attempted intervention found themselves overmatched by the combined might of both Sith Lords. As they escaped into waiting transport, Ulic looked back at Coruscant burning behind them. The operation had failed in its immediate objective, but they'd proven something more valuable. The Republic couldn't protect even its capital. The Jedi couldn't stop them, and the war would continue until one side or the other was completely destroyed. There could be no peace, no negotiation, only final victory or total defeat. The galaxy would bleed until one philosophy or the other drowned in that blood. The escape from Coruscant should have felt like victory. Instead, tension between the two Dark Lords crackled like electricity through their shared transport. Exar Kun radiated cold fury at having been forced to personally intervene. Ulic burned with humiliation at needing rescue, his pride wounded more deeply than any blade could cut. They returned to Sinagar without speaking, each lost in thoughts about power dynamics and hierarchy. The Sith philosophy demanded strength, rewarded dominance, but their alliance required cooperation. These contradictions created friction that both recognized would eventually need resolution. Alima Keto had disappeared. Her betrayal was complete. The Krath fleet scattered to territories she'd claimed as personal domain. Ulic wanted her dead, wanted to hunt her across the galaxy until he could personally extract payment for treachery. But larger concerns demanded attention. The Republic had survived Coruscant's assault. More than survived, they'd captured and humiliated the Sith War commander. That psychological wound needed healing through overwhelming demonstration of continued power. Exar Kun had plans for such demonstration, ancient Sith techniques he'd been preparing since establishing himself on Yavin 4. But first came the unexpected arrival that would reshape everything. A small Jedi vessel penetrated Sinagar's defenses, broadcasting surrender codes and requests for parley. Scanners identified only a handful of occupants, no weapon signatures, no obvious threat. Curious despite suspicion, Ulic allowed it to land. His brother Kay emerged from the ship. Years had passed since they'd seen each other. Cassie looked older, worn by war and grief. But his eyes still held light that Ulic had lost. The younger brother had come not with Jedi army, but alone, except for small team, including Nomi Sunrider. A rescue mission. One final desperate attempt to bring Ulic home. They met in the Iron Citadel's courtyard, brothers separated by ideological chasm that felt wider than the galaxy itself. Kay's first words were simple. Come back. Not demands, not accusations, just plea from one brother to another, carrying weight of shared childhood, of training together under Master Arca, of promises made to their dying teacher. Kakei spoke of their mother on Alderaan, of how she wept when news reached her of Ulic's fall. Spoke of friends who still hoped, who still believed redemption was possible. Ulic listened in silence, his face carved from stone, revealing nothing. When Kay finished, when the younger brother stood there with tears streaming down his face, Ulic's response came cold and absolute. The Jedi way is death, slow death of potential, of power, of everything that makes life worth living. You're slaves to ancient philosophy that demands weakness disguised as virtue. I've been freed from those chains. I'll never return to them. Kay tried arguing, tried reasoning, tried everything except the one thing that might have worked, which was simply embracing his brother and refusing to let go. But Jedi training emphasized words over physical affection, and Kay was still too much a Jedi. The confrontation escalated as Krath warriors gathered, sensing potential threat. Nomi stepped forward, her presence hitting Ulic like physical force. Their eyes met for the first time since his fall became complete. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The grief and disappointment radiating from her through their force bond said everything. For a moment, just a heartbeat's duration, something flickered in Ulic's yellow eyes. Recognition of what he'd destroyed, understanding of what he'd sacrificed for power, that suddenly felt hollow. But the moment passed, crushed under weight of pride too immense to allow vulnerability. Nomi's voice when she finally spoke carried resignation. That was somehow worse than anger. You're already dead. The man I loved died the moment he believed his own lies. What wears his face now is just shadow pretending to be substance. Those words cut deeper than any blade. Ulic wanted to rage, to deny, to prove she was wrong. But some fundamental honesty remained in him, buried beneath layers of self-deception, and that honesty recognized truth in her assessment. The Jedi team departed without him. Kai looked back once before boarding, his expression carrying such profound sadness that even craft warriors looked away. Brothers who had been inseparable were now enemies divided by choices that couldn't be unmade. Ulic watched their ship disappear into atmosphere, feeling nothing, or rather, feeling so much that the only defense was numbing it all into nothing. He'd chosen this path. Chosen power over love, strength over connection. Those choices had consequences. Regretting them now changed nothing. Days became weeks. The war intensified. Exar Kun launched new offensives with his Dark Jedi Brotherhood. Mandalorian forces under Mandalore's command swept through additional systems. The Republic bled from 1,000 wounds, their military stretched impossibly thin, their resources depleting faster than they could be replaced. But the tide was slowly turning. Republic strategists learned to counter Ulic's tactics through sheer adaptability. Jedi developed techniques for combating dark side users through concentrated teamwork. Most crucially, populations in occupied territories began organizing resistance, making governance nearly as costly as conquest. Exar Kun recognized these warning signs. The war's momentum was shifting, not decisively, but enough to concern him. He needed something dramatic, something that would break Republic will to resist through demonstration of overwhelming power. He possessed theoretical knowledge of ancient Sith superweapon, space station-sized construct capable of triggering stellar events, making stars go supernova, destroying entire systems. But the technology required was scattered across multiple worlds, its construction dependent on resources they couldn't gather while fighting defensive war. Alima Keto, in her ignorance and ambition, had stumbled upon one of these weapons. She'd taken it from a conquered world, believing it would secure her position. She had no idea how to properly operate it, no understanding of the catastrophic forces contained within its mechanisms. When Republic forces finally cornered her fleet near the Kron cluster, she activated the weapon in desperate bid to destroy her enemies. But the device, mishandled by someone with insufficient knowledge, didn't simply attack the Republic ships, it destabilized the cluster's stars themselves. 10 suns began dying simultaneously. The chain reaction, once started, couldn't be stopped. Hoi supernovae erupted across the cluster, their expanding shock waves consuming everything nearby. Alima's fleet, the pursuing Republic forces, and racing outward toward inhabited systems that had existed for millennia, toward Ossus. The Jedi homeworld, repository of accumulated wisdom, suddenly faced extinction from stellar fire that couldn't be outrun or defended against. Master Ud Bina sent desperate warnings, calling every available Jedi to evacuate the Great Library. They had hours, maybe days, to save whatever knowledge they could before 10 supernovae converged on their world. The scramble to preserve holocrons and ancient texts became desperate race against approaching annihilation. Ships landed, loaded treasures representing millennia of accumulated learning, and fled as fast as hyperdrives could carry them. But there wasn't nearly enough time to save everything. Master Ud Bana made his final choice. The ancient Neti, using abilities unique to his species, transformed himself into a tree. His roots drove deep into Ossus soil, his branches spreading to protect chamber containing the most irreplaceable holocrons. He would become their vault, preserve them through his sacrifice, ensure that even if Ossus died, some knowledge survived. The shockwave hit like the universe's fist. Ossus's surface burned under radiation that sterilized continents in seconds. Oceans boiled away. Atmosphere ignited. The Jedi who hadn't escaped died instantly, their final moments hopefully too brief for suffering. And deep underground, Surrounded by Master Ud Banner's transformed body, precious holocrons survived, waiting in darkness for the day someone might return to reclaim them. The destruction of Ossus broke something fundamental in the galaxy's spirit. Not just a world lost, but the accumulated wisdom of ages, the heritage of the Jedi Order, the irreplaceable connection to their own history. What survived in evacuation represented fraction of what existed. The loss was incalculable. Ulic learned of Ossus's fate through military reports. He'd trained there, studied in those archives, walked those gardens with Master Arca. Every memory of his youth was tied to that world, and now it existed only as radiation-scorched corpse orbiting a dying star. He felt nothing, or told himself he felt nothing. The numbness that had become his default state expanded to fill the void where grief should have lived. Feeling nothing was easier than acknowledging that Alima's action, betrayal that stemmed from his own choices, had killed thousands and destroyed irreplaceable treasures. Kai learned of Ossus differently. He'd been there during evacuation, had helped load ships with whatever could be saved. He'd watched the shockwave approaching, had felt through the force as thousands of lives were extinguished in an instant. The trauma marked him in ways visible to anyone who looked closely. When news reached him that Ulic had returned to Krath territories, when he learned that his brother showed no remorse for Ossus or any other atrocity, something in Kay broke, not his commitment to the light, but his hope for his brother's redemption. He gathered a strike team, volunteer Jedi willing to infiltrate Sinagar for one purpose, not to capture Ulic, not to negotiate, but to end the threat he represented permanently if necessary. Kay told himself he was being strategic, making difficult command decisions, but truth was simpler and darker. He was going to kill his brother if redemption proved impossible. The infiltration succeeded through a combination of skill and desperation. Kay's team fought through Kry's security, losing members with each level they advanced. By the time they reached the throne room where Ulic held court, only Kay remained, his lightsaber stained with blood of beings he'd killed to reach this moment. Ulic turned to face his brother, surprise flickering across features before being suppressed. They were alone. No guards, no witnesses. Just two brothers who had once shared everything, now separated by chasm of choices and consequences. Kay spoke first, his voice cracking with emotion. "One last chance. Please, if any part of you remains, if there's anything of the brother I loved still inside that shell, come home. We'll face council judgment together. I'll stand with you through whatever punishment they demand. But please stop this. Stop the killing. Stop the war." Ulic's response came flat and dead. "The brother you loved is gone. There is only what I've become, and I will never submit to Jedi judgment." Kay's lightsaber ignited, not in attack but readiness. He gave his brother one final opportunity to choose differently, to step back from the abyss. But Ulic simply drew his own weapon, that blue blade he still hadn't replaced with Sith red, and settled into combat stance. They fought, brothers who knew each other's styles intimately, who had trained together for years, whose techniques were mirrors of shared foundation. The duel raged through the throne room, both men drawing on everything they'd learned, every technique mastered, every advantage available. But Kay was still Jedi, still constrained by unwillingness to kill. He fought defensively, seeking disarmament rather than death, hoping even now for some miracle that would return his brother to sanity. Ulic fought with dark side enhanced fury, channeling years of suppressed grief and guilt into raw aggression. Every strike was meant to kill, every technique designed for maximum lethality. Once Kay realized too late that his restraint was fatal weakness, Ulic's blade slipped past his guard, penetrated his chest, the lightsaber's energy burning through heart and lungs in a single devastating thrust. The younger brother fell, his weapon deactivating as fingers lost strength. Blood spread across ornate floor, staining marble with final price of misplaced hope. And Ulic stood there, blade still extended, watching his brother die by his hand, and something fundamental shattered. All the rationalizations dissolved. All the justifications crumbled. All the lies he'd told himself about noble purposes and necessary sacrifices were revealed as the self-deception they'd always been. He'd murdered his brother, not in combat between enemies, not in defense of anything meaningful, but simply because pride and darkness had consumed him so completely that he'd become exactly what he'd once sworn to fight. The lightsaber fell from his grip, its blade deactivating before hitting floor. Ulic collapsed beside Kay, pulling his brother's dying body into his arms, finally allowing himself to feel the enormity of what he'd done. The Kay's final words came as whisper, "I forgive you, brother." Then his eyes closed, his breathing stopped, and Ulic Qel-Droma was left holding the corpse of the person who had loved him most in all the galaxy, having just murdered him for no reason beyond his own corruption. His scream tore through the Force itself. Every sensitive being in the city felt it, raw anguish transmitted at volumes that made even dark-siders recoil. The darkness that had sustained him collapsed inward, revealing void beneath everything he'd built his identity upon was revealed as hollow. Nomi Sunrider felt that scream from orbit, where she'd been waiting with reinforcements for Kay's team. She understood immediately what it meant, knew without needing confirmation that Kay was dead, knew that Ulic had killed him, knew that whatever remained of the man she'd loved was drowning in belated recognition of his own monstrosity. She gathered other Jedi on her ship, masters who had developed techniques specifically for situations like this. The Wall of Light, an ancient method of cutting Force users off from the energy that powered them. Permanent severing, removing connection to the Force entirely, leaving behind hollow shell that could still breathe and move, but would never again touch the power that gave life meaning. They descended on Sinagar, not for combat but judgment, found Ulic still kneeling beside his brother's body, unresisting, broken. He looked up when they entered, his yellow eyes fading back to blue for the first time in months, and simply nodded. He understood what was coming, accepted it as insufficient but appropriate punishment. Nomi led the ritual, her voice steady, despite grief threatening to overwhelm her. She loved this man, had loved him, still loved the ghost of who he'd been. But the Jedi who had become war criminal needed consequences that transcended normal justice. The Jedi gathered their power, channeling it through Nomi as focus point. Pure light side energy, concentrated to painful intensity, surrounded Ulic like cage of searing radiance. He felt his connection to the Force, that sense that had defined his entire existence, being systematically cut away, like losing limbs, like losing senses, like dying while remaining alive. The severing was complete in moments that felt eternal. When it finished, when the light faded, Ulic Qel-Droma was empty, still breathing but hollow, still conscious but profoundly alone in ways that no words could adequately describe. The Force that had surrounded him since birth was gone, that constant companion, that additional sense, that connection to the fundamental energy binding all existence was simply absent. He reached for it instinctively and found nothing. The void where it should have been was more painful than any physical wound. Nomi looked at what remained of Ulic, seeing only shadow of the man she'd loved. Her final words to him carried no anger, only sadness that felt bottomless. "You're free to go. You're no longer a threat. You're no longer anything." They left him there with his brother's body, a powerless shell who had once commanded armies, alone in throne room that felt like tomb. The brightest lights cast the darkest shadows, and Ulic Qel-Droma, who had once burned brighter than any Jedi of his generation, had created shadow so profound that it consumed him utterly. The galaxy doesn't pause for personal tragedy. While Ulic knelt beside his brother's cooling corpse, powerless and broken, the Great Sith War reached its final terrible crescendo. The Republic, sensing vulnerability in the Sith command structure's fracture, launched coordinated counteroffensive across multiple fronts. Exar Kun found himself defending territories he'd conquered while simultaneously losing the tactical genius who had made those conquests possible. Dark Jedi Brotherhood fought with zealous fury, but zealotry couldn't replace strategic brilliance. Mandalore the Indomitable died during rearguard action on Onderon. His body never recovered. His death broke Mandalorian unity, various clans fragmenting as they argued over succession. Without their warrior culture's discipline and organization, Sith forces lost crucial military advantage. Ulic emerged from his grief eventually, driven by instinct for survival that transcended even despair. He couldn't remain on Sinagar. The world held too many memories, too much blood, too much evidence of everything he'd destroyed. And while the Republic might no longer consider him threat, they'd still execute him if given opportunity. But before fleeing, he made single choice that would partially define his remaining years. He contacted Republic military commanders with detailed intelligence about Exar Kun's operations, Yavin 4's location, temple layouts, defensive capabilities, the Dark Lord's strategic weaknesses and tactical patterns. It wasn't redemption. Information shared while standing in his brother's blood could never approach redemption, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that the war he'd helped start needed ending, and he possessed knowledge that could accelerate that conclusion. Republic received this intelligence with suspicion bordering on contempt. Some argued it was trap, elaborate deception designed to ambush their forces. Others recognized authenticity in details only someone with Ulic's access could provide. Eventually, desperation outweighed caution. They'd accept help from any source if it meant ending the bloodshed. The Jedi Order mobilized every available resource for final assault on Yavin 4. Hundreds of Jedi, thousands of Republic troops, a fleet massive enough to blockade the entire moon. They came not to conquer, but to exterminate, understanding that Exar Kun represented existential threat that required absolute elimination. The Battle of Yavin 4 became legend for its brutality and scale. Dark Jedi defended their temple fortresses with fanatical determination. Massassi warriors, transformed through Sith alchemy into creatures barely recognizing their own humanity, fought until no flesh remained capable of movement. Exar Kun himself wielded powers that made reality itself seem negotiable, his command of ancient techniques allowing him to kill dozens simultaneously. But he was one being, however powerful, against hundreds of Jedi working in concert. They surrounded his primary temple, cutting off escape routes, systematically destroying his defenses. When Exar realized defeat was inevitable, when he understood his physical body couldn't survive the assault, he made desperate choice. The ritual he performed had been forbidden for millennia, banned by Sith and Jedi alike for its horrifying price. It required life energy, vast quantities of it, to fuel transformation from physical existence to pure Force presence. The Massassi people, who had worshipped him as God, became fuel. Thousands died instantly as Exar drew their life force into himself. Their bodies collapsed mid-action, drained so completely that even corpses seemed withered and ancient. The energy he stole allowed him to separate spirit from flesh, to trap his consciousness within the temples themselves, becoming dark side presence that would linger for millennia. His body died, but his essence persisted, aware and malevolent, waiting patiently for the day someone might accidentally release him. The Jedi who entered the temple afterward felt his presence like weight pressing down. They understood that while they'd won the battle, eliminating Exar Kun completely had proven impossible. The best they could do was seal the temples, quarantine the moon, ensure no one inadvertently freed what lurked within. The Great Sith War ended not with dramatic surrender, but gradual collapse. Leaderless Sith forces fragmented into warlord territories. Dark Jedi, without coordination, became isolated threats rather than unified army. Republic forces methodically reclaimed systems through patient campaign that prioritized stability over speed. The final accounting of casualties took years. Trillions dead across dozens of worlds. Entire civilizations erased. Ossus destroyed along with irreplaceable knowledge accumulated over 10,000 years. The Jedi Order reduced to fraction of its former strength. Economic devastation that would require generations to repair. And throughout this aftermath, Ulic Qel-Droma wandered alone. Without the Force, he experienced galaxy as normal humans did. Small, limited. Every sense felt dulled compared to what he'd known his entire life. He couldn't sense approaching danger, couldn't feel others' emotions through their presence, couldn't touch the energy connecting all living things. The isolation was more profound than physical solitude. He walked through crowds and felt utterly alone, surrounded by presences he couldn't perceive beyond sight and sound. It was like losing hearing and vision simultaneously, while remaining conscious, being cut off from dimensions of reality he'd taken for granted. He traveled to worlds devastated by war. He'd helped orchestrate, saw refugees displaced by his strategies, met orphans created by campaigns under his command. Each encounter was fresh wound, reminder of consequences that could never be undone. Some recognized him. Former soldiers who'd fought under his leadership, civilians who'd survived his occupations, beings who'd lost family to his orders. Their reactions ranged from rage to grief to something worse than either. Pity. They looked at broken shell of legendary warrior and felt sorry for him. That pity cut deeper than hatred would have. He didn't seek forgiveness, knew better than to insult survivors with requests they couldn't grant even if they wanted. He simply moved through their presence like ghost, acknowledging suffering through silent witness while understanding his observation changed nothing. Years accumulated like scar tissue. Ulic aged in ways Force users typically didn't, their connection to universal energy slowing biological decay. Without that protection, mortality caught up with accumulated damage from decades of combat and Force channeling. His golden hair turned gray, then white. Lines carved themselves into face that had once been smooth and confident. His body, which had moved with supernatural grace, became ordinary, slower, weaker, mortal, in ways he'd never truly been before. He found work where he could, manual labor that didn't require references or background checks, loading cargo, repairing equipment, tasks that kept hands busy, while mind remained trapped in endless loop of memory and regret. The work was meditation of sorts, physical exhaustion, providing brief respite from psychological torment. Former Kryth territories collapsed into chaos without leadership. Populations that had accepted Sith occupation now faced power vacuums filled by warlords and criminals. The stability Ulic had imposed through Force dissolved into anarchy worse than war itself. Another consequence, another failure. He visited battlefields years after conflicts ended, walked through sites where thousands had died following his orders. Grass grew over mass graves, trees sprouted from soil enriched by decomposing bodies. Nature reclaimed devastation with patient efficiency, covering evidence while changing nothing fundamental about what had occurred. On one such world he encountered survivors building memorial to those killed during Mandalorian raids. They worked with quiet determination, carving names into stone that would outlast memory. Ulic watched from distance, recognizing locations described in memorial text as sites where he'd personally directed operations. An old woman noticed him standing there, weathered face studying his features with recognition that made his stomach clench. She'd survived the raids, lost husband and children, somehow recognized the architect of her loss despite years and aging that had transformed him. She didn't scream accusations, didn't call for justice. Simply looked at him with eyes that had seen too much suffering to hold additional rage. Then she returned to carving names, her silence more damning than any words. Ulic almost approached her, almost attempted explanation or apology. But what words existed for such magnitude of harm? Sorry seemed obscene. Explaining his motivations would sound like justification, so he stood there until she finished her work and departed, leaving him alone with stone testimony to his crimes. He began seeking isolated places, worlds where population was sparse or non-existent, couldn't bear encountering more victims, couldn't endure more of that terrible pitying recognition. Solitude became preference, then necessity, then the only bearable state. During these wanderings, he occasionally sensed traces of Force activity, couldn't feel it directly anymore, but could recognize its effects. Objects moved without visible cause, beings demonstrating abilities beyond normal capability. Each encounter reminded him of what he'd lost, created phantom pain in spaces where connection should have existed. He avoided Force users whenever possible, Jedi especially, though few remained after war's devastation. Their presence highlighted his emptiness, made void where Force should have been, feel more profound, and he feared their judgment, despite no longer being subject to Force-based techniques. But guilt required no Force connection. Guilt was purely mortal, purely psychological, and it pursued him with relentless efficiency. Some nights, when exhaustion finally permitted sleep, he dreamed of Kay. His brother appeared as he'd been before war, young and laughing, training together under Master Arca's patient guidance. The dreams were mercy and torture simultaneously, brief respite from reality, followed by waking that reinforced what he'd destroyed. Other dreams were darker, battles he'd commanded, worlds burning under orbital bombardment, faces of beings who'd died following his orders. These dreams didn't end upon waking. They bled into consciousness, haunted daylight hours, refused any boundary between sleep and awareness. He considered suicide during worst periods, ending existence that served no purpose beyond bearing witness to its own failure. But even that felt like escape he didn't deserve. Living with consequences seemed minimal price for causing such devastation. A decade passed this way. Then another. Ulic Qel-Droma became rumor, then legend, then forgotten footnote to larger historical narrative. The galaxy moved forward. The Republic rebuilt. The Jedi Order slowly recovered. And the man who'd nearly destroyed everything became nobody, exactly as Nomi had predicted. Eventually his wandering led to Renvar, frozen world in galaxy's northern reaches. Ancient ruins dotted ice-covered landscape, remnants of civilization that had flourished millennia ago before climate shift rendered planet nearly uninhabitable. The isolation was absolute. The cold was punishing. It was perfect. He established shelter in ruins that provided minimal protection from elements, survived through techniques learned during exile, hunting what sparse wildlife existed, rationing supplies obtained during rare trips to nearby systems. Days blurred into months, months into years, time lost meaning when every day was identical, struggle against cold and memory. The ice preserved him in ways beyond physical, froze him in permanent state of penance, trapped between death and life, unable to move forward or back. He existed rather than lived, breathing and functioning, while remaining fundamentally absent. But even on Renvar, even in self-imposed exile light years from civilization, the past refused to release him. Because someone was coming, someone seeking wisdom that only fallen warriors possessed. Someone whose arrival would force him to confront whether anything remained worth salvaging from his ruined existence. A ship descended through Renvar's atmosphere, its landing creating steam clouds where hot engines met frozen ground. and Ulic Qel-Droma, who had wanted nothing but isolation, discovered that the galaxy wasn't finished with him yet. The young woman who emerged from the ship moved with Jedi grace. Ulic recognized her, despite years of change. Vima Sunrider, Nomi's daughter, now grown into a full Jedi Knight. She approached without hesitation, her voice steady against howling wind. "I've been searching for you. I need to understand." Ulic studied her, trying to comprehend why any Jedi would seek him out. But Vima's expression held no condemnation, only desperate need. She'd been experiencing anger, not righteous indignation, but genuine rage that frightened her. Frustration with the Council's conservative approach, impatience with traditions that seemed designed to constrain rather than elevate, temptation to take power she felt capable of wielding instead of waiting for permission. The feelings terrified her because she recognized their echo. Every fallen Jedi had experienced similar thoughts. She needed someone who'd walked that path and could explain where it truly led. Ulic's initial response was silence. What wisdom could he offer? His life was an object lesson in failure. But Vima persisted. She traveled across the galaxy searching for him specifically because his failure made him qualified. So Ulic began speaking, describing his journey from idealistic Jedi to Sith War Commander, not justifying, simply recounting facts with brutal honesty. He explained how infiltrating the Krath had seemed noble, how each compromise felt justified by larger purpose, how the dark side hadn't announced itself with trumpets but had whispered rationalizations, how certainty in his own incorruptibility had been the very weakness that ensured corruption. The most dangerous lie, he told her, wasn't believing darkness was good. It was believing you could use darkness for good purposes, that you were special, that you were strong enough to remain unchanged by power that had corrupted everyone before you. Days passed in conversation. Ulic shared details he'd never spoken aloud. The moment he'd killed his brother, the sensation of being severed from the Force, the countless faces of beings who'd suffered because of his choices. Vima absorbed these lessons with growing understanding. The anger she'd been nurturing revealed itself as an early symptom of the disease that had consumed him. She could see the path now, understand where seemingly justified frustration led. After a week, Vima prepared to depart. She'd found what she came seeking, not techniques or powers but perspective. Before leaving, she offered genuine gratitude for wisdom earned through suffering she'd been spared. She departed Renvar with renewed commitment to Jedi principles. The visit had saved her, and in saving her, had given Ulic's suffering some meaning beyond punishment. That fragile sense of purpose lasted 3 days. The second ship arrived without warning, landing with aggressive speed. Silvar emerged like fury incarnate. The Cathar Jedi, widow of Crado, had been hunting Ulic for years. Her husband had died serving Exar Kun, and she blamed the war commander for that loss. She'd tracked him across the galaxy, never abandoning pursuit. Now she'd finally found him, alone, powerless, vulnerable. Ulic didn't run. He simply stood there, understanding this confrontation had always been inevitable. Silvar's lightsaber ignited. She spoke through clenched teeth, listing his crimes, describing Chryse's death, execution without trial, vengeance masked as justice. Vima's ship, which hadn't yet departed orbit, detected the new arrival and returned. She positioned herself between them, trying to reach Silvar through her rage. Killing Ulic wouldn't resurrect Chryse, wouldn't accomplish anything beyond adding one more death to an already infinite pile. But Silvar was beyond reasoning. She'd spent too many years nurturing this hatred, so she attacked. Vima defended with skill, but fought defensively, still hoping to disarm rather than harm. When Sylvar finally broke through her defense, when her blade swung toward a killing strike, Ulic moved. Just a mortal man, throwing his body between blade and target, accepting what he couldn't deflect. The lightsaber pierced his chest. Ulic felt his body's functions shutting down, but he felt no fear, only profound relief. Finally, he could rest. The burden of continued existence was lifted. He fell to frozen ground, his blood steaming. Weimar rushed to his side, trying futilely to stem bleeding that couldn't be stopped. Sylvar stood there, watching her vengeance manifest with an expression suggesting victory felt nothing like she'd expected. Ulic's vision faded, but through encroaching darkness, he saw something impossible. Light, pure force energy, visible despite his severing from that power. Kay appeared first, not as ghost but as presence, real as anything physical. His brother smiled with forgiveness, extending his hand. Master Arca stood beside him, eyes holding pride rather than disappointment. Others gathered beyond, Jedi who'd fallen during the war, even Mandalore, the indomitable, all of them waiting. Ulic understood. The Force had never truly abandoned him. His severing had been punishment administered by mortals, but the Force itself didn't recognize mortal judgments as final. Genuine repentance, suffering genuinely endured, transformation genuinely achieved, these open paths that doctrine insisted were closed. He'd spent decades in penance, had used his failure to prevent others from repeating it, had accepted death protecting someone innocent. His spirit separated from his failing body, rising toward the light he'd thought forever lost. And as he joined those who'd gone before, as he felt the Force embrace him, he understood redemption's true nature. Not forgiveness from those he'd wronged, not erasure of crimes committed, simply acceptance that even the fallen could rise if they genuinely tried, that the light never completely extinguished, that the Force was patient beyond mortal comprehension. His body remained on Renvai, cooling in the ice, but his spirit soared free, joined with Kai, reunited with Master Arca, finally coming home. Nomi Sunrider felt it from thousands of light years away, that distinctive Force signature she'd loved, severed for so long, suddenly blazing bright before ascending. She understood Ulic had died, understood he'd found peace. Tears came, mixture of grief and relief. Weimar knelt beside his body, thanking him for wisdom shared, for sacrifice made, for demonstrating that redemption remained possible even for those who fell farthest. Sylvar stood apart, her vengeance achieved but hollow. Killing Ulic hadn't restored Kraid, hadn't healed her grief. She'd pursued this goal for years, and now faced the emptiness of victory that resolved nothing. The two Jedi departed Renvar separately, each carrying their own lessons, and on the frozen world, Ulic Qel-Droma's body slowly disappeared beneath accumulating snow. Ice covered his features, preserved him, created a tomb from the landscape itself. But in the Force, eternal and unchanging, his spirit lived, reunited with those he'd loved, free from guilt that had defined his mortal existence, transformed from cautionary tale into testament that no fall was too deep to prevent eventual return. The galaxy remembers the fall, the devastation, the war that killed trillions, but the Force remembers the rising, the redemption earned through suffering, the light that persisted even in deepest shadow. So the story of Ulic Qel-Droma remains, warning and hope simultaneously. Reminder that darkness seduces but light endures, that falling is easy but rising, while infinitely harder remains always possible. On Renvar, wind howls across ancient ice. Snow falls eternally, covering and revealing in cycles measured by millennia. And beneath that ice lies the body of a Jedi who fell and rose, who caused unimaginable harm, yet ultimately found peace. The Force flows through all things, through ice and wind, through living and dead, through darkness and light. Eternal, patient, waiting always for those who seek it. And in that eternal flow spirits reunite, brothers embrace. Teachers welcome students home. Warriors rest after battles that spanned galaxies. All of them together in the Force, all of them at peace. Sleep now, knowing that no night lasts forever, that even the deepest darkness eventually yields to dawn, that falling is not final but merely difficult part of a longer journey toward light. Rest in the knowledge that the Force surrounds us, binds us, connects us, that love persists beyond death, that redemption remains possible even when we're certain we've destroyed any chance of it. The stars watch over Renvar tonight, as they've watched for millennia, and beneath their patient gaze, a fallen Jedi rests, his story complete, his spirit free, his legacy, both warning and hope. May you find peace in your own rest. The light endures, love transcends, and redemption awaits those genuinely seeking it, patient as the stars themselves, eternal as the Force that flows through all existence.